Baptism, it's a problem. Or at least it was for the young son of a Disciples Christ minister I once knew. He was in church one morning when he saw for the first time baptism by immersion. He became greatly interested in the ritual, so much so the next morning he decided he needed to baptize his 3 cats. Well, the youngest kitten bore it pretty well, and the younger cat did the same. But the old family cat, he just wasn't having it. That feline struggled with the boy, clawed and tore at his skin, finally got away. With considerable effort, the boy caught the old cat again, attempting to go through this ceremony. But the cat just clawed and spit and scratched the boy, and so finally, after barely managing to get even a sprinkle of water onto the cat, he put him on the floor in disgust and said, "Fine then, just go and be a Methodist." Well, I'm pretty sure I said those words in one way, shape, or form to my wife somewhere along the way. As most of you know, Marion is an ordained United Methodist pastor. And so what do United Methodist ministers and Disciples of Christ ministers debate before they get married? Well, how to baptize your children, of course. After all, the United Methodist Church practices baptism by sprinkling infants, while we disciples practice believers' baptism by full immersion. Like so many ecumenical marriages, we found a compromise for our family. Clara and Harrison were dedicated in Disciples of Christ congregations and then baptized into United Methodist congregations. We just hope they turn out doubly blessed and not doubly confused. Although for most of us, when it comes to baptism, it tends to be more the latter than the former. But let's be honest, baptism has been for quite some time a significant confusion and conflict for the church. Not just for families that come from different traditions, but throughout church history. Congregations have fought about it. Denominations have broken away from one another over it. In fact, baptism has been so widely debated, it's one of the most debated practices of all time throughout Christian history. I wasn't kidding when I said, baptism is, and always has been, a problem. And the problem begins, of course, when Jesus comes to be baptized. While you can sense that each of the gospel writers struggles to understand Jesus' need for baptism, things are even further complicated in Luke, when John the Baptist mentions not only a baptism by water, but also a baptism by fire. Not to mention this winnowing fork and clearing the threshing floor. The basic question, though, still remains. If Jesus is the Messiah, why on earth does he need baptizing? Given that we typically connect baptism to forgiveness of sin, if Jesus is in fact the sinless Son of God, as Christian tradition teaches, in what way does he really need baptism? Even more broadly, how does baptism benefit Jesus at all? I can remember the first time I baptized someone after being ordained. It was a foreign exchange student from China who'd been living with a family from the congregation I was serving at the time. She'd been in the States for about a year when she first approached me about being baptized. If I'm honest, at first, I thought it was kind of a problem. I knew she didn't come from a Christian family and that she was only in the United States for another year before she'd return home. I wondered if she was just being influenced at a young age by her culture or was giving into pressure by her host family or kids at school. So I spent quite a bit of time with her, making sure she understood the decision that she was making. During our last session together, I felt I needed to be more frank with her, so I just said, before long, you're going to be going back home. Your parents aren't 100% supportive of this, not to mention being Christian in your country is not an easy thing to do. Are you sure you want to go through with this? And she replied in her broken English to me, Pastor Nathan, this is just who I am now. She said to me what all the gospel writers essentially say about baptism. It's not a mechanism necessarily for forgiveness, but rather baptism announces God's presence in one's life. It establishes outwardly one's identity as a child of God. Or at least that seems to be what has happening in every account of Jesus' baptism, including Luke's version this morning, when the voice from heaven announces, "This is my Son, the one with whom I am well pleased." Which at first might seem to sort of calm down the debate, or at least give in part an answer to the question. And yet it isn't always so straightforward, is it? In fact, I can't help but wonder if there's anything more complex, more confusing in our world today than one's identity. Not long ago, a book was released with several new Dr. Seuss poems in it, one of which was entitled The Great Henry McBride. It begins like this. "It's hard to decide," said young Henry McBride. "It's terribly, terribly hard to decide. When a fellow grows up and turns into a man, a fellow should pick the best job that he can, but there's so many jobs that would be so much fun, it's terribly hard to decide on just one." And so Henry McBride goes on to choose more than one. Along the way, he becomes a farmer, a physician, a radio broadcaster, even a SEAL trainer. In fact, by the end of the poem, he's all of these things, or as Dr. Seuss puts it, a SEAL training doctor, the broadcasting rabbit man, two-gun McBride. In the book is an illustration of Henry McBride juggling all these hats seemingly quite well. However, I couldn't help but think about all those competing things that make up our identities today and become, quite frankly, a bit overwhelmed. After all, we're Campbells and Gibsons, Elliots and Blackburns. We're parents and grandparents, children and grandchildren. We're teachers and contractors, doctors and entrepreneurs. We're Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. We're dogs and yellow jackets, falcons and braves. There are so many jobs that would be so much fun, it's terribly hard to decide on just one. And yet all the ways we describe ourselves on social media, or when we meet someone for the first time, or identify ourselves on an application, I wonder where our identity as God's children falls on that long, lengthy list. If at all. Which for me raises the other side of this baptismal problem. What then does baptism really mean for us? Or put it more pointedly, why does baptism mean so little to us? I realize I'm generalizing here. Many take very seriously and remember with great fondness their baptism. But while the day itself might be a big deal for some, our emphasis on baptism almost seems to end there. How many of us remind our children of their baptism or celebrate the anniversary of a baptism with anything similar to the attention we place, say, on our birthdays? I know Marion and I certainly don't. But even more than this, my experience is that folks outside of deeply religious families have very little understanding of what baptism really means or why it matters. Most think it's the way to save one's soul, but notice Jesus' baptism says nothing about hell or being saved. Instead, it's about who he is. And even more, as Katie said, whose he is. Which I worry is an identity that seems to be becoming less and less a priority in our lives. Just think about it perhaps this way. When you wake up and you look at yourself in the mirror in the morning, are you first and foremost, above all other things, one with whom God is well pleased? I'm not sure I am. I read this week about a survey that was taken recently about those things which inform people's stances on immigration today. Of all the factors that form our opinions about this issue, including things like political affiliation and geographical location, only 7% of the people surveyed indicated that the Bible, religion, or the church informed their stance on immigration policy. 7%. Don't get me wrong, I get it's not easy to claim this identity. We all know too well the heat that Jesus took for it, and that by following him, we'll do the same. Come to think of it now, it's no wonder John references a baptism by fire, which makes those baptismal waters into which we wade perhaps not as rosy as we typically make them out to be. In fact, I can't help but wonder if they're a little more dangerous than we like to think of them. They certainly are in the Middle East right now. Apparently the Jordan River region, where Jesus is baptized, was landmined following the 1967 Six-Day War and declared a military zone. Booby traps were placed in 7 monasteries in the area and declared off limits to the public. While a team of Israelis, Palestinians, and Georgians are attempting to clean up the area and make it safe again, it's still a dangerous place to go. Well, there aren't any landmines in the sanctuary this morning, but I realize that coming forward to reconnect to your baptism may not be so easy today. It's no wonder the church has made baptism into more about forgiveness of sin and being saved from hell than our identity in Christ and our call to follow in his footsteps. One is certainly more safe than the other. Although I've noticed recently some are sharing their identity with the world. I was scrolling through my Facebook feed a couple weeks ago when I noticed someone had shared a memory of their baptism from several years ago. In fact, it was a selfie with their pastor. It was certainly a way to remember their baptism I hadn't considered before. But I've been thinking about that picture this week, and I can't help but wonder if Jesus' baptism, and all of our baptisms for that matter, are not a sort of selfie in a sense. A snapshot moment of who we are and of whose we are. Because such a picture isn't just meant to be filed away in a photo album and placed on a shelf. No, a selfie is meant to be uploaded and shared with the world. Let's be honest, once it's put into cyberspace, it's really out there for everyone to see. Isn't that really what's supposed to happen with our own baptisms? Be prepared, though. I can promise you some will not get it. I mean, what kind of person would stand up for the impoverished? Or advocate for and visit the imprisoned? Or love their enemy? Or forgive even when forgiveness isn't deserved? Or welcome the outcast? Or work for unity? I know someone, a child of God, with whom God is well pleased. And perhaps that's the real baptismal problem in the end. Once you claim this identity, not just go through the motions of it, but truly accept and try to live as one of God's children, then your life will inevitably become more complicated. It will be problematic. That's what happens when you post a selfie that's controversial. There's just no way around it. Baptism is a problem. And it's the most absolute best problem